This video was originally recorded November 2017 at the annual Force for Good class series. To learn more about this ongoing class series, please visit tibethouse.us.
Okay, is the mic's working? Yay, okay. Okay, are we ready? It's time to start. All right, well, welcome back, everybody. See some new faces here that weren't here last time. So, and welcome everybody in cyberspace. All right, so tonight, we're going to be mainly talking about the second of the three trainings, or three educations. The mic's working, yay, okay. Oh, let me mute this, okay. So I mentioned last time, this was the blurb for what we're doing, and that we're going to be discussing the three higher educations, or adhishikshas, traditionally organized into three interrelated disciplines of ethics, meditation, and wisdom. So we spent a fair amount of time, introducing The force for good concept, and looking at the Dalai Lama's particular connection with Nalanda University. So we talked a fair amount about what Nalanda is, and about the fact that the Dalai Lama actually considers himself to be what he calls a practitioner of the Nalanda tradition of wisdom. And he actually just says, I'm that, as opposed to calling myself a Hinayanist or Mahayanist, which I thought was quite interesting. So even most of you know that Hinayana and Mahayana are generally considered the two sort of vehicles of Buddhism, individual and universal. So for him to actually say, I don't even consider myself primarily a Mahayana Buddhist even, but I consider myself a practitioner of the Nalanda tradition of wisdom, was somewhat surprising perhaps. So we looked into that a fair amount last time, and those of you who weren't here last time can, I assume, Tasha, they can see online, it's archived. So you can watch that and learn about, we spent probably half the session talking about what was Nalanda University, and the fact that it really covered all of the arts and sciences of India up through the first millennium. And it includes a lot more things than what we normally think Buddhism includes. It's much broader than what is even captured by the term religion. So much so that I last time talked about the fact that I think that perhaps even considering Buddhism, to the extent to which there is an ism, is perhaps not best looked at as a religion, but a series, an entire spectrum of really arts and sciences for cultivating the human person, for human flourishing. So it does include all the arts and sciences, but traditionally, all of the arts and sciences, we also looked last time at many ways in which arts and sciences can be categorized. One way in which they can be categorized from a Buddhist perspective is according to this threefold division. So that's the way I've organized these three talks, and last time we introduced the wisdom part of it. We'll probably be continuing to discuss that today to some extent, but we'll be mainly focusing on this section of what's called meditation. So some of you probably know that of the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering that the Buddha realized. There's many ways to summarize kind of what Buddhist teachings are. We discussed that last time as well. The shortest of which is probably just to say wisdom and compassion, which we'll come back to today. But as you know, it's oftentimes summarized in terms of the Four Noble Truths. So the Buddha realized the truth of suffering, the fact that suffering has a cause. It's not just random. Things don't just happen for no reason. So suffering has a cause, and it actually, because it has a cause, the third fact is the fact that you can interfere with that cause. You can stop the cause, and he claimed to have discovered that you can actually permanently root out the cause of suffering. So you can create conditions for the permanent cessation of suffering. And this term suffering is sort of a difficult term to translate, dukkha. It really means sort of suffering writ large, or the lack of flourishing. So misery, dis-ease, that type of thing. It's not just what we normally think of as suffering. It's actually sort of being limited in a lot of different ways. So you can interfere with that, and the fourth fact was the fact of the path, the fact that there's a way to do this. And as probably most of you know, the Noble Path is divided into 8 sections, the Noble Eightfold Path, which looks like this. Let me bring up the right one here. So on the left here, we have the 8 branches of the Noble Path. You'll almost always see these translated as right, R-I-G-H-T, right view, right consideration, intention, right speech, and so forth. It's really not a great translation, and as you know by now, I like to be nitpicky with translation terms, but the word samyak doesn't really just mean right, as in right, wrong, like there's sort of a judgment being made that this is good, right, and this is bad, wrong. It certainly has that sense to it, but it's a little bit deeper than that. So I think realistic or authentic, there's other ways you could translate that. Authentic view or realistic view, realistic consideration or intention, authentic or realistic speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. And traditionally these 8 are categorized, as you can see in the middle column, into the 3 higher educations that we've been discussing. So wisdom, ethics, and concentration. Although, as I always point out, if you start to look at it, we won't even look at the final column there in terms of canonical divisions, because it really doesn't, it's sort of an artificial way of lining these things up, because certainly the sutras, as you see in the bottom right corner, discuss all 8 or all 3 of the categories. So it's kind of, that's sort of an artificial lineup. But to some extent, you could even say that The other ones get a little bit mixed up as well, but they are sort of aligned in this way. But before we jump into this, what I want to point out is, and I briefly touched on this last time, and Damien Keown in a book called The Nature of Buddhist Ethics, this is of course a book we read in the Buddhist Ethics class up at Columbia. He also discusses these 8. You can see here he's translating them as right. And what's interesting is looking at the Pali Sutras where this division into 3 comes from. In his analysis, he noticed, I'm not going to read through all of this, but I'll just cut to the chase here. He finds 13 suttas in Pali where the Eightfold Path is discussed and the 3 higher trainings or higher educations are discussed. And what he notices and points out is that it's by no means consistent. It's not like this is a clearly defined set of 8 and 3 in the Pali Sutras. In fact, quite the opposite. So what happens over time is within the tradition, they sort of decide to distill it into 8 and 3. But I think he's right to point out that, for example, of the sutras that discuss these kinds of things, sometimes there's as many 13 aspects of the path, not just 8. And of the 3 that are mentioned, sometimes there's really only 2 that are mentioned. So he has a 2-fold and a 3-fold possibility. And the Roman numerals represent the suttas he's looking at. So in 2 of the suttas, it discusses charana and vijja, or shila and panya. So charana is something like activity, actions, behavior. And vijja is like knowledge. So the entire path divides into action and knowledge. Or it divides into shila and panya, which would be ethics and wisdom. And in some of the sutras, it divides into 3 things. Shila, in each case, you can see is there. And that's ethics. And the 3rd thing there, vidya, is knowledge, and panya, wisdom. That's about the same idea. But you'll notice that middle column, charana, chitta, samadhi, it's different each time. Charana, again, means something like activities. Chitta means mind, really. Samadhi means something closer to meditation or concentration. So he notes that there's no uniformity in terms of these. In particular, the nomenclature of the middle stage, when specified, is different in each case. Apparently, the individual factors of the path are not so important as the general categories which contain them. This may be seen from the lesser discourse, so he quotes something, a sutra, in which, in this particular sutra, he says, "But lady, is the Noble Eightfold Path composite or incomposite? Noble Eightfold Path, friends, Visakha is composite, so it's made up of different components. Now, lady, are the 3 categories arranged in accordance with the Noble Eightfold Path, or is the Noble Eightfold Path arranged in accordance with the 3 categories? The answer is, friend Visakha, the 3 categories are not arranged in accordance with the Noble Eightfold Path, but the Noble Eightfold Path is arranged in accordance with the 3 categories." So the point here being that, well, he goes on and makes the point, it would seem then that it is the broad categories of the path, these 3, which are of primary importance rather than the number or precise definition of their individual contents. The categories indicate the areas in which the development is required, while their contents sharpen the picture by pinpointing specific practices or prohibitions. Makes sense, right? Similarly, the path to arhatship, he's looking at the Pali Sutras, so they're talking about the path to arhatship. It's a similar set of 8 in the Mahayana as well. In 13 stages described in the collection, we conceived as personal development, morality, meditation, and insight, but it's also possible to regard the 3 spheres of perfection as binary, as we just saw. So you can look at it 3, but you can also look at the binary. That is to say, as founded upon just knowledge and conduct, or morality and insight, or I would translate ethics and wisdom. The ambiguity centers on that middle section, as we noticed, what's normally called meditation, and I suggest this is because meditation is primarily a means for the promotion of and participation in the basic goods of morality and knowledge. I'll read that again, and I agree with this statement. The ambiguity centers on that middle section, and I suggest that this is because what's being called meditation is primarily a means for the promotion of and participation in the basic goods of what's really primary, which is ethics and wisdom. The position I adopt throughout this book is that the final perfection to be attained by those who follow the path to arhatship, and again, same in the Mahayana, is best understood in terms of a binary model. So as I mentioned earlier, in the Mahayana it would be called wisdom and compassion. Compassion being sort of the quintessential form of ethics in a Mahayana context. So wisdom and compassion, again, binary really. It's a binary, say it's the perfection of ethics together with the perfection of insight, as he translates it. Meditation is a technique for the cultivation of these other two faculties. And I will argue in terms of the value structure, the tripartite scheme of Sila Samadhi Prajna, ethics, meditation, and wisdom, can actually be collapsed into the binary one in the manner described above. So the reason I'm harping on this is because I think it's actually important to recognize this, because I think particularly in the West, most people studying Buddhism or practicing Buddhism, most Dharma centers you'd go to, most people tend to think that Buddhist practice really means meditation. If somebody asks you, oh, do you practice? You know, you've been studying Buddhism, but do you practice? That means, do you meditate, right? And oh, my Buddhist practice is good this week, or it's not good, or last weekend I was practicing 3 hours a day. That means to meditate. And what I'm emphasizing here is that based on what I just showed you, that's actually a mistake. To equate those two as a mistake. So I will actually write that on here. Just this is my own take on what we just saw here, is that whatever Buddhist practice is, when we use that term, I think it would be a good habit to stop considering that as equal to meditation, which is what we normally think of. So it's not equal to meditation. Instead, what practice is, in fact, is ethics, or compassion, if we want to give the Mahayana version of that, or bodhicitta to take that up even another level, and then wisdom. Practice is these two. That's what practice is. You're doing one of these two. Meditation then, which I'm going to put in quotes because we're going to problematize that term in just a second. What meditation really means, that term, is these are techniques. What these really are, so I'm going to actually cross out the word meditation, and you'll see why in a minute. Actually, I'm also going to give you some reasons why that's not the best way to translate this, what it is we're looking at here. What there really are some techniques of or for cultivation. And I like the term cultivation better. That's what's typically called meditation. And this strengthens or informs or, let's say, empowers these two. So there are a lot of techniques that are taught within Buddhist theory and practice. And these techniques, which is what we're going to be discussing today, are techniques that are used to enhance or support or empower your development of ethics and wisdom. That kind of reverses it from how we normally think, because we normally think that, well, we know ethics is important. But it's quite common, I think, and it's not just Westerners. I mean, this was a common debate and complaint that occurred throughout Buddhist history in India and Tibet in particular, but also in East Asia. You would frequently have different Buddhist masters complaining that the people of their time were getting a little bit too hung up on meditation. For example, Kamalashila in the 9th century in India, who was important to the transmission of Buddhism into Tibet, writes an entire book, a series of books, 3 books called the Bhavana Akramas, or the Stages of Meditation, in which, among other things, he talks about what meditation is and what it isn't, but among other things, he talks about the errors or the problems of delighting in meditation, and as if that's the end goal, as opposed to in wisdom. So, yes, these techniques are important, and in fact, they're essential for making serious, rapid progress on the path, but they're essential as supports for developing insight or wisdom, and for empowering and undergirding and strengthening your compassion, or for strengthening any of the 6 paramitas, 6 perfections in the Mahayana sense. So we'll keep that in mind, and we'll kind of come back to that periodically today. Okay, so we're going to be exploring a number of terms here. So let me bring up this document. Right, so that's the overview of today. So when we say meditation in the West, when we use the word meditation loosely, one thing I want to point out is that term, there's a lot of terms in Sanskrit or Tibetan within the Buddhist language that are directly related to what we call meditation. These are terms, you can see both my English rendition on the left and then the Sanskrit and Tibetan. So bhavana is the most generic one, which is what usually was translated as meditation. Again, I'll tell you why I would prefer to translate that as experiential cultivation, development, or integration. But also samadhi, samapati, dhyana, yoga, sthana bhavana, savichara bhavana, vipassana, shamatha, smriti, sampradanya, and which is sometimes translated correctly as mindfulness. The point is, there's a whole host, again, of techniques, right, which are just, we all just call it meditation. And actually, within each one of these, there is an enormous spectrum of possibilities. So to say, if somebody asks you, do you meditate, or if you hear, oh, there's going to be an introductory course on meditation at some place, it almost means nothing. It should mean nothing. Or to put it more accurately, it's so vague. If somebody asks you, do you meditate, that's more vague than somebody asking you, do you sport? Which is the best analogy I can think of. Do you sport? I mean, by sports, I mean, what do you think of when you think of sports? Football, baseball, jogging, professional football, flag football, softball, swimming, parachuting, I mean, cross-country skiing. To be athletic, let's say, to be engaged in athletics, to be engaged in sports, that's such a vague term. I mean, it's good. I guess if you're engaged in athletics, that means you're sort of taking care of your body in some way. But what that means is the spectrum is so wide, you have to get more specific. The term bhavana, which we're calling meditation for now, is even wider than that. Okay, so to ask, do you meditate, or how's your meditation going, or did you hear there's an introductory course in meditation this weekend, it doesn't tell you a lot, any more than if there's an introductory course on sports or athletics this weekend, okay. Usually it means something particular when somebody says that or when it's presented that way. It usually means shamatha, and again, we'll be discussing today what that means. But it really should mean a much larger spectrum of things. So those are terms directly related to what we call meditation, and terms indirectly related to meditation include things like creation stage and generation stage, perfection stage rather, within tantric practice, yoga with signs and without signs, evocation to directly manifest, conceptual yogas, etc. Many terms connected with yoga, many of which come from the tantric vocabulary. So right here we have 15 or 20 different words, all of which sort of in one way or another imply what we generally think of when we say meditation. So if we back out to the bigger view here for a minute, what we can say is that really the most generic term, the proper generic term, is bhavana. That's the most generic term. Of all those terms we just looked at, the umbrella term is bhavana. And bhavana is gomba in Tibetan. And bhavana, actually, it's helpful to know the etymology of that. So bhavana comes from the verbal root bu, to be, just the verb to be. And ana is like an instrumental suffix, so it means to make something be. So I put down here literally, making it be, or becoming. So if you have a technique for making something be the case, that's bhavana. And again, we normally when we think meditation, we think it's doing this and sitting in a certain way and so forth. It can be doing this. There's certain physical postures that can enhance, but it's not necessarily doing that. In fact, it can be something you do on the subway. It can be something, in general terms, any technique you apply to make something be the case. Now, what is it you're making be? You're making your mind, your experience, come into line with what you know to be the case. So, an example, the easiest example I can think of that I've thought of is we know, for example, at least we think we know, after Copernicus and Galileo and others, that the geocentric model, the notion that everything revolves around us, is inaccurate, that actually the Earth is revolving around the sun, the heliocentric model. Even though we know that intellectually, what happens every morning when we wake up and we see that beautiful, we have that experience of what? The sun rising, right? The sun rises. And so this is a good example of where you know something's the case. You know the sun isn't actually rising, and yet it really looks like it's rising, and we sort of intuitively experience it as rising and setting. So there's a disconnect there. We know something to be the case, and yet we experience it otherwise. So how do you make your experience come to line with what you know? Is there a technique for doing that? If there is, that's making it be. That's bhavana. And one of my favorite Buddhist yogis is Arabic Buckminster Fuller from the 1960s. You remember him? So he actually was bothered by this very same fact that he knew the sun wasn't rising yet he saw it that way, and he came up with a very Buddhistic solution, analysis of the problem and solution. His analysis was that for whatever reason, there's a number of reasons why it does seem to make sense that the sun's rising, and yet it's that intuitive sort of obvious fact that the sun seems to be rising is enhanced by and supported by our culture, because we talk that way. Everyone's sort of, you're raised saying, isn't it a beautiful sunrise or sunset? But also our language supports that, because we call it sunrise and sunset. And that's actually a very Buddhistic kind of analysis, is to note how language supports incorrect experience, or it's an incorrect construction. So the first technique he said was, okay, I'm going to stop calling it sunrise. It's the wrong term. So he coined some terms. They're kind of awkward, but he's coined the term sun sight, S-I-G-H-T, and sun clips. And starting with that linguistic change, calling it sun sight and sun clips, he then started training himself to experience, when he saw that happen in the morning, experience that I'm standing on a big, huge globe, 8,000 miles across, that's rotating towards this thing, this ball of fire, which is now coming into sight. And it's not that difficult to imagine doing this. We have that experience of relative motion anytime, like if you're on a boat or a train platform and you see something moving, and then suddenly you realize actually it's still and you're moving, right? And you suddenly get dizzy sometimes. You like lose your bearings for a second because you were in the wrong relative frame of reference, or So we have that experience. So he simply did that with sunrise and sunset. He came and retrained himself, partly through a linguistic change and then partly just through contemplatively imagining being on this 8,000-mile ball. That's bhavana. That is exactly what bhavana is. And I like the fact that if you take this geocentric mistake, right? If you just take those letters and rearrange them, you get the egocentric mistake. The egocentric mistake is the exact same idea. It's the idea that I exist and everything, my ego exists. It really is the one thing I know is real, and everything in the universe revolves around me. I'm the center of the universe, and everything revolves around me. I'm the most important thing, etc. And again, as we know from what we began to discuss last week, that is considered the sort of fundamental mistake from a Buddhist sort of analysis point of view. So are there some, but it sure feels like I really exist, A, and number A, and B, not only do I exist, but my existence is sort of the most important existence. Everybody else and everything else, it either relates to me in some way that's helpful to me or problematic for me or that I could care less about, but it all comes down to me. That, according to the Four Noble Truths, that is the fundamental type of misperception or misconception, which the Buddha calls misknowledge. Not ignorance, by the way. Again, the translation of avidya is not ignorance. To be ignorant is to not know something. To have misknowledge is to know something, but to be wrong about it. So I know I exist as an independent, separate self that's bigger and more important than all of you. It just turns out that knowledge that I'm quite certain about, it's not just intellectual knowledge, it's intuitive knowledge. It's just obvious, I just know it. Turns out that's misknowledge. I'm wrong about that. So just like we can do the flip with the geocentric model, here we're taking an egocentric model and we're trying to analyze that through some of what we looked at last week and come to realize that actually no, there's multiple frames of reference and I'm not the center of anyone's universe, and in fact there's not even maybe a center here. So that's bhavana. Any technique you come up with that helps you make something be the case, make your experience come into line with your understanding, that's bhavana. And hence a good translation for it, rather than making something be or becoming, perhaps we could call it cultivation or experiential cultivation. That's one translation I like. Development or integration. Development because you're developing, right? You're developing yourself. You're developing your understanding, your conception, your perception. That's okay. I put it in parentheses. It's not my preferred. Even integration is not bad, because what Buckminster Fuller was doing was he was taking the fact that he knew the sun was coming into sight, and he was integrating that. He was making it part of who he is, so that he sees the world that way. Rather than being an intellectual thing that's sort of separate from his experience, he made his understanding and his experience come together and sort of meld into one thing. So it's like integrating something into yourself. So integration is not bad. It's instructive to note that the Tibetan term for bhavana, they didn't just take the etymology of making something be, working with the Sanskrit pundits, it's always educational to look at how the Tibetans and Sanskritists work together, and oftentimes it's a literal translation, but sometimes it's not. Even a key term like Buddha is translated slightly differently when they say Sangye. But in this case, bhavana, they translate it as komba, and there's various forms of that verb, but that verb really means to familiarize. That's what it means in Tibetan. So familiarization is actually the proper translation of the Tibetan term. And it's not a literal translation of bhavana, but it does get what it means. So to familiarize, right? That's what Bucky Fuller was doing. He was making it familiar. He was making it part of what rather than being some alien thing that was sort of unfamiliar and wasn't integrated into who he was making it a familiar part of who he was. So to familiarize yourself, it probably has a negative connotation to say to routinize or to habituate, but those terms aren't entirely off the mark either. If you do something over and over and over again, it becomes a habit. Anytime you have a bad habit, right, you sometimes try the opposite habit, and if you do it over and over and over again, eventually it becomes routine. It just becomes kind of what you do. So habituation or familiarization is also what bhavana means. If that's the umbrella term, that's the main idea, right? Then again, it helps to know that within the Buddhist way of looking at what this entails, there's really two main categories of bhavana, and those are what I've written here. Static or stabilizing meditation or cultivation, which in Tibetan is jokbe gomba. The asterisk in front of the Sanskrit means that's a reconstructed term. And then analytic meditation, savichara bhavana. And those would be more familiar to you probably. The types of those that are terms you're maybe familiar with are shamatha and vipassana. So on the left, the main type of static or stabilizing meditation that you're probably familiar with is shamatha. You see the Sanskrit here, or shine in Tibetan. And that is typically, a lot of people still use the Hopkins translation for that, calm abiding. A little bit literalistic. I don't really like that translation as much. Serenity or quiescence. Shamatha has to do with peacefulness. But in fact, and we'll be talking about this to some extent today, and it's just what it sounds like. So there's a form of static or stabilizing meditation, which is actually the better term, I think. Because when you look at shamatha, what it means, although it literally translates as quiescence, that is after the ninth stage of meditation, you reach a stage which is so focused, your mind is so solid and focused and stable that you have a sense of incredible peace. But the point is not peace. I mean, it's sort of a byproduct. It's wonderful to be peaceful, but the whole point of the meditation isn't to peace out. The point of the meditation is to develop incredible mental stability and focus. That's what shamatha is all about. So it is actually the main sort of version of static or stabilizing meditation. So in a way, that term, jokbe gomba in Tibetan, as opposed to shine, it would almost be a better way to think of what this is. It's not just attaining peacefulness. It's really attaining focus and stability. On the other side, there's other categories of cultivation that are more analytic or discursive. So did I put that term? No. So we could say analytic or discursive. Analytic / discursive. Discursive. And that's just what it sounds like. These are like what Bucky Fuller did to some extent. It's where you're using your mind, your analytical mind, your discursive mind to work through a problem, like what we were doing with the 4 dots and the bee last time. Anytime you're trying to analyze the nature of reality, is it really this way or not? And you're going deeper and deeper and deeper in your mind, thinking through problems and coming up with solutions or coming up with things that seem to be the case, but now you can see that they're actually incoherent. Everything you do in Madhyamaka philosophy, for example, that's a type of, quote, meditation. It's analytic meditation. Again, I think in the West, we mistakenly don't think of that as meditation. We think of that as discursive thinking or conceptual thinking, and it's sort of put over here, and maybe it's put down lower, and meditation is sort of this better thing. No, they're both meditation. In fact, they're both essential. And this is part and parcel of, this isn't any one particular tradition within Tibet or India. This is shamatha and vipassana are the 2 types of meditation within any Buddhist discourse. And again, Kamalashila, who wrote one of the major synthetic scholarly books on this topic, who was key in terms of establishing Buddhism in Tibet, along with Padmasambhava and others in the 800s, he wrote this Bhavana Akramas. He talks about how what awakening or full spiritual development entails is the integration, the bringing together of shamatha and vipassana. If all you do is develop shamatha, which we're going to discuss in a minute, which is really where your mind has the ability to totally focus and be solid and stable, if that's all you do, that does not liberate you from samsara, does not liberate you from your ego. It can produce some very nice states. It can produce rebirth in heavenly realms. It can do all kinds of things for you. That can last for a long time. It can last for years. It can certainly make your life way, way better. It's totally great, but it's not, and this is something that was clear even in the Pali Sutras. This is what the Buddha practiced when he was Siddhartha before he became a Buddha, various forms of concentration that develop these sublime sort of trance states that he recognized are really amazing and can be used to full awakening, to end suffering, but in and of themselves do not produce liberation. So shamatha by itself does not do the trick. What does the trick is what really liberates you is getting rid of misknowledge. So getting wisdom. Wisdom is what actually liberates you. And that's the wisdom that understands emptiness or selflessness, which we discussed last time. And importantly, always remember that means, in fact, it's important enough, I'll write it down again. I'll use a different color here. So emptiness, which we discussed last time. So wisdom pertains to this topic, right? Wisdom pertains to emptiness, and emptiness equals relativity, or if you want, dependent origination, dependent arising. We'll say dependent origination. Actually, more accurately, it's interdependent origination. It's important to if there's nothing else you remember or learn from last week or that you take away from this week about empty, is that equation. If you just like tattoo that on your forehead or write it in Sharpie in your meditation hut, that's really, really important because it'll help dissuade you from falling into the easy trap of thinking that emptiness means some sort of spaced out sort of, maybe it's nothingness, it's some sort of, it's not. Emptiness does not exist as the term is sort of a little bit misleading, but we discussed that last time when we considered the word zero and so forth. It doesn't mean nothingness, and it doesn't exist in the abstract. Emptiness, the concept of emptiness, or what the emptiness entails, only exists with respect to something specific. So if I have a specific table in front of me, I can now talk about the emptiness of this table, or the selflessness of this table. And it always means, it's the other important thing, it always means emptiness with respect to, or voidness, or selflessness with respect to something. Emptiness, so with respect to, or there's other ways to say that, but with respect to independent, or objective, or intrinsic reality or status. It sounds like a mouthful, but what that simply means is when you say that the table is empty, you're saying it's empty of having an objective table self to it, tableness to it. There's four legs there, and there's a top, and in my mind, in our minds, we can construct that and call that a table. No problem, we can agree to call that a table, but there's not a table there that exists separate from in our minds, putting it together like we did with the four dots last time. We're constructing that. And so there has to be four legs and a top for us to now construct a table. You can't just look into empty space and construct a table. So when we did the four dots last time, I know some of you weren't here, but we put four dots on the board and asked, what is that? And most people saw it was a square, but then we problematized and realized those four dots could be connected into a circle, or they could be not connected at all. You could connect three of them into a triangle and leave one of them as sort of a miscellaneous dot that you don't care about. When you see four dots in a pattern like this, it's not by itself, it's not intrinsically a square. It's a square if you make it a square. Same with anything. And getting a little bit more profound beyond squares and things like that in tables, eventually, of course, you take that same analytical ability and you start turning that on yourself. And what is the basis of your perception of having an independent, objective self? It's mind and body and different aspects of mind and body, but somehow there seems to be a coherent or intrinsic self that I feel like I have that maybe owns all of these different components, these aggregates as they're discussed sometimes, or encompasses them, or somehow it controls them all, but somehow there's some sort of a self that's sort of associated with these things, just like it seems like there's a self or an objective table sort of within these 5 parts here, the 4 legs on the top. So they spend a lot of time in philosophy, in Buddhist philosophy courses, dissecting things like tables and chairs and chariots and bicycles and trees and things, with the aim eventually of turning that same analysis on the self. So, but to say that there's not a table ultimately is not to say there's no table, right? There is a table conventionally, and we discussed this last time. There is a self conventionally. You do have a conventional self or a relative self. So how do you exist? You do not exist independently or objectively or intrinsically, but you do exist interdependently. So that's why emptiness equals interdependent origination. To say something is empty is not to say it doesn't exist. It's to say it exists interdependently. And I like the way the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh discusses this. He talks in terms of, rather than I am and you are, he says we inter-are. He talks about interbeing. So we inter-are, right? That's another nice way of putting it, which is quite different than I am and you are. That's we inter-are. We co-create each other. We create each other in context. So doing this kind of thing, this is analysis, what we're doing now. Everything we're talking about there, this is doing analytical thing, and this is a form of meditation, and that is what actually liberates you. That's what creates the end of suffering if you really get it on a deep level. The problem is if you just do it intellectually in a classroom or by reading some books, you can only go so deep, in part because this isn't just an intellectual habit, it's also a deeply instilled, it's a habit is what it is. It's actually just a misconception and misperception habit. It's not something you learn in school. In a Buddhist perspective, all sentient beings have this fundamental mistake. Animals do, worms do, insects do, gods do, ghosts do. Any kind of sentient being has this mistaken conception and perception. Why? It's just a habit. It's an incredibly ingrained habit. From a Buddhist perspective of multiple lifetimes, it's a habit that's been reinforced for an infinite number of lifetimes. So talk about a bad habit. It's been reinforced by ourselves and by whatever culture we've been in for an infinite number of lifetimes. So it's an incredibly deeply ingrained instinctual habit, but it is possible to break that habit, but it's not easy. So the one step to breaking it is to get it intellectually to understand why the notion of an independent self is incoherent. It actually doesn't make sense. It actually does not make sense. It's incoherent. Then, in order to have that new understanding penetrate you deeply onto a deep enough level where it's actually even getting down to your unconscious level, that's why shamatha is important. The ability to have your mind be so focused and stable that you can take that insight and push it down to the deepest level, rather than your mind sort of like going, as soon as you start to get close, your self, your ego will start to go, what about the burrito I'm going to have for dinner tonight? Oh, where were we? We were talking about the self. It just gets distracted. And so actually distraction, the ability for the mind to get distracted and not stay on point, is precisely one of the things you're pushing against when you're doing shamatha meditation. And so that's one of the main things we'll be discussing today. So last time when we were discussing analytic or discursive meditation, last week when we were discussing wisdom, we were actually discussing what is done when you're doing this analytic meditation. So today we'll spend a little bit more time talking about some of what shamatha involves and how you push your way into having greater and greater stability and focus and attention in the shamatha side of things. But it's instructive to just know that according to Buddhist analyses, all forms of meditation, so all those 20 terms that we just looked at a minute ago, they all fit into one of these two categories. So creation stage yoga, for example, you're visualizing yourself as a deity in a tantric practice. That is actually, what's unique about Tantra is actually it combines both shamatha and vipassana. I should have said, in exoteric forms of Buddhism, so Sutrayana Buddhism, it's considered you have to do both of these, but to integrate them and do them simultaneously is considered almost impossible. In other words, you sort of do one or the other, and you get really good at one, and then you start to integrate it in the other, and you get really good at that, and you go back and forth. It's kind of like doing this until finally They're integrated only at the moment of enlightenment or awakening, actually. One of the things that's unique about tantric practice is on the path, very early on, you're actually coming up with, they're using techniques that integrate shamatha and vipassana right from the get-go. That's what deity yoga is, and again, we may discuss that a little bit today because that's part of one of the topics that's involved in experiential cultivation is the practice of deity yoga, which is what's done in Tantra. In brief, just to give you the short answer to that or reason for why that is, and then we'll go back to shamatha, but deity yoga is defined, probably you know if you've read texts on Tantra, by the Dalai Lama, by Hopkins, by myself, by Robert Thurman, by a few others. The deity yoga is defined as at least by Tsongkhapa and Gelugpas and many others. It's not universally defined this way in Tibet, but it's quite commonly defined this way. And Tsongkhapa looks at hundreds of texts in India and comes up with this definition as sort of what he thinks is the best takeaway from Indian Tantric Buddhism. And that is that deity yoga is what's unique about Tantra. That's what makes Tantra a different vehicle, is the practice of deity yoga. Number one. Number two, the definition of deity yoga is important. And the definition of deity yoga is not just visualizing yourself as a deity. If it were that, as a Buddha. If it were that, it would be fantasy. And it would actually be a lot of problems with just imagining yourself to have a Buddha body. It's specifically the mind realizing emptiness, the way Hopkins translated it, so you may be familiar with this phrase, the mind cognizing emptiness arising in the form of a deity. That's Hopkins' way of translating. That phrase has been around since the 70s. The mind cognizing emptiness, or you could say the mind realizing emptiness. And I would say rather than arising in the form of the deity, I would say perceiving oneself, one's body in the form of a Buddha deity. And the word deity here always means a Buddha form. So think about that for a minute. It's not your normal mind. Your normal mind thinks what? Your normal mind thinks dualistically. It thinks I have an objective self. I'm a limited self. I have an ego. If that was the sense of self, if that was the mind or the mental state that was now visualizing that I'm a Buddha deity, that's going to lead to megalomania. That's going to lead to like schizophrenia. It's going to lead to all sorts of problems. If your normal ego starts thinking and imagining and visualizing yourself as a Buddha, that's a problem. If your mind realizing emptiness, so you have to realize emptiness to some extent, intellectually and then now experientially. In other words, if you're able to dissolve your sense of ego, and you're not coming from that point of view, now it's a non-self, a non-ego or a non-self that is now appearing or being perceived as a Buddha form. What's happening is two things simultaneously. A mental state of cognizing emptiness or realizing emptiness in a form of a Buddha body. That's shamatha and vipassana. You can see how that's shamatha and vipassana integrated or combined. It's awareness of emptiness and yet having a focus on something. And the focus now is, instead of your breath or some other object, you're focusing on the Buddha body that you're visualizing. Okay, so that's Tantra in a nutshell. There's a lot there to be covered, of course. Maybe we can discuss that further on later today. But that's how they ultimately can be integrated. Normally, however, we have a dualistic mind that's doing whatever it's doing. And therefore, the dualistic mind can practice shamatha separate from vipassana. And so that's what we'll discuss now for a bit. And then I'll stop and we can have some discussion. Including for those of you who are online. You can apparently you can type questions, I guess, in your chat. And then Tasha can read me any of your questions or comments. So some of you probably, let me just show you a couple of my favorite books. There's been a lot of books written on shamatha meditation. A lot of classes given. Again, when people say meditation now in the West, they almost always mean shamatha, which is okay. And if you want to if you're going to go take a class on meditation, it'll likely be shamatha. Although it could be something to do with looking at the nature of the mind, some kind of a dzogchen kind of a thing, but we'll talk about how that relates to shamatha in just a minute. Of the many, many meditation courses that are out there and the many, many books have been written on this, one of my favorites that I would highly recommend to you is this one, How to Practice Shamatha Meditation, Cultivation of Meditative Quiescence. It's translated by Alan Wallace. Alan Wallace is one of the main authors nowadays of shamatha. This has been his career. So you probably know he's a PhD Buddhist studies, but also in physics. So he has both sort of a physics background and a Buddhist studies background, and then he was a monk for many, many years. And he's a prolific author. So he's got scores of books out there, and his main theme has been for many decades, his dissertation was on this topic, and for many decades he's written books on shamatha. So translations of books from India, from Sanskrit and Tibetan, as well as his own books. So I recommend many of his books. Just Google him, look up B. Alan Wallace. He's in more recent years or decade or so, he's sort of moved over into Dzogchen largely, which again, we'll discuss that briefly today, what that is. What this book is it's actually, there was a retreat that was done in the Pacific Northwest led by a Tibetan Lama named Genla Rinpa. So Genla Rinpa is leading a shamatha retreat in the Pacific Northwest for a few weeks. A bunch of Westerners were there learning shamatha, and what this book is it's essentially a transcript of that retreat. So Genla Rinpa would give a set of teachings on certain aspects of shamatha in the morning. Those are then be transcribed in the afternoon, and people go off and meditate, and then they come back and ask questions in the afternoon, and then those are transcribed. So it's a really useful book, chapter by chapter, because Genla Rinpa is sort of really unpacking all the stages of shamatha, the obstacles, the remedies, and so forth, and you're getting the benefit of having beginning students ask all kinds of questions, which are the kinds of questions that you would probably ask yourself if you try this kind of meditation. So this book is fantastic, and then the same team, Genla Rinpa and Alan Wallace, came up with this book called Realizing Emptiness, but Yamaka Insight Meditation, and you'll notice Insight Meditation is the translation, one of the translations here for Vipassana. Vipassana means literally intense seeing. So you can see here, it's sometimes called Transcendent Insight. Meditation can be in brackets, or sometimes it's just called Insight, or Special Insight. Those are all good translations for Vipassana, which is this main form of analytic or discursive meditation over here. So I would say these two books are incredibly accessible. For any kind of meditation, you're not going to learn how to meditate out of a book. I mean, you might learn something, but you really do want to have a meditation teacher, just the same way you could go to the gym and start picking up weights, but good luck not injuring yourself. You probably want a trainer. So you probably want a trainer, a mentor who's going to teach you meditation. But it does help, I definitely think, to not just go in cold, just go and say, all right, start teaching me. I think it really helps to have a background, and either of these books, and there's many other books on both topics, but the more you sort of know, then the more you're informed if you then go get a meditation teacher. Find a good one. There's some not so good ones out there, but try to find a good meditation teacher, armed with some information, and then start practicing it, and you'll start to get the experience yourself of these two types. So in terms of shamatha meditation itself, I don't know if you've seen this wonderful picture, these wonderful sets of pictures. People familiar with these pictures? Most of you, look at you all, you're all experienced shamatha meditators. What am I talking about? So this is depicting the 9 stages of what happens when you practice shamatha. And what is depicted here is you can see a monk, and these are just 2 versions of the same idea. So I'll look at this one here on the left. Yeah. The bottom, you see on this path, you see a monk who's chasing a black elephant, and also the black elephant you see is being led by a monkey. And you'll notice that the black elephant, well, you notice he's black. So what is the black elephant? It's you, but it's specifically your mind. Here they're talking about, it is ego, yeah, but here we're really talking about the state of your mind. So the idea here is that for the uncultivated person who hasn't done any meditative practice, any cultivative practice, your mind is out of control. And I think most of us can probably relate to that. It's like a wild elephant. It's just like bull in a china shop, right? It's like a wild elephant out of control. And not only is it out of control, but you'll notice it's black. And the color, and you'll notice as the elephant goes up, it starts changing color. The fact that it's black, so it's out of control, it's like a big, huge, massive beast that's out of control. It's running ahead of the monk, right? So your mind has gotten out ahead of you. The fact that it's black, that represents that it's very dull or very dark. The mind is very sort of sedated. It's very stupid. It's very dull. And so that represents a dull quality of the mind. And the monkey represents, does anybody know what the monkey represents? It's another aspect of the mind. The monkey mind, yes, or distraction. The fact that your mind's just like a monkey. It's like going all over the place. So here it's kind of a little bit confusing because the mind is being sort of represented by multiple animals and colors, right? But so be it. So the monk is trying to get a hold of his own mind. He is carrying, you'll notice, a lasso and a goad. And those are going to be tools that he uses to try to get control of his mind. And we'll see about that in a minute. So as we go up this path, you'll see a number of things. You'll see the monk, you'll see some flames. The flames indicate the amount of effort required. It's a huge amount of effort in the beginning to even get beyond stage 1 or 2. And the flames get a little bit less as you go up, indicating that it's a little bit more doable. The more you get control of your mind, the easier it is to get more control of your mind. You'll notice a bunch of other sort of decorative ornaments and so forth. Those represent the senses. They're less significant to the primary aspect of the painting that we're looking at, the 5 senses and so forth, and some flowering trees and some other nice things, some water. What's really important is what's on the path. You'll notice that monk is getting closer and closer to the elephant. In the second stage, he's a little bit closer. The monkey's not running quite as fast. The elephant's not quite as black. So all of this indicates the fact that through focusing his mind, through learning to keep the mind, and the technique that's used here typically, as most of you probably know, when practicing shamatha, this is where you do, for this kind of meditation, you do sit in the 7-point posture of Vairocana. That's with your back straight and your head slightly tilted forward and the tongue on the roof of your mouth and your hands in this position on your lap and so forth. All of these bodily positions have to do with creating a energy balance, basically, within your body. And what's also important, a lot of people don't do this, is to have your eyes not wide open but also not closed. You do not meditate with your eyes closed, not this kind of meditation. Because why? What you're going to do in that posture, you can choose any object. The standard object that's used especially for beginners is the breath, because the breath is something that we always have. You have a breath coming in and out of your nose. You can focus on the sensation of the breath coming in and out of your nose and just count to 10. Count 10 breaths and do that over and over again. What will happen in the beginning, if you've never done this before, is you'll get up to 10, no problem, and you'll do another set of 10, and you'll do another burrito with extra salsa, and oops, I forgot, was I at 7 or 4? You lose track of where you were because your mind has gotten distracted. Or worse, or maybe not worse, but the other option is you fall asleep. So one way or the other, the device of counting to 10 is really a device that's just used in the beginning because it's a simple metric that just tells you, as soon as or sometimes you count to 21, but you're counting breaths, you're really trying to focus on the sensation of the breath on your nose, but if you lose track of the count, you know your mind got distracted. If you fall asleep, well, you fell asleep. So if you get distracted and you lose count, that's the monkey. And if you fall asleep, that's what's called mental laxity or lethargy. That's you're falling into a state of coarse. There's coarse and subtle versions of both of these. So coarse distraction is just you lose count totally. You lose the object of what you're trying to focus on. So what you're learning how to do here is just discipline your mind, right? Your mind is totally crazy, and you're saying, it's like disciplining a child or a pet or anything else. You're saying, no, I'm going to make you do what I want you to do. That's what the lasso and the goad have to do with. These have to do with, this is what's called mindfulness and introspection. These are two of the tools you're using then to, mindfulness is really keeping your, is the ability that you have to make your mind do what you tell it to do. Introspection is a little bit different. Introspection is something, it's an aspect that becomes more key as you go up the ladder. Introspection is an aspect of your mind that you kind of use to, you break off and you monitor. It's like a self-monitoring thing. That's where, and that's what's noticing, maybe once I get to the point where I'm not losing count anymore. You're not losing count when, see where the monkey starts, he even starts to turn white, and eventually the monkey is behind the elephant, right? At that point, there's no longer gross distraction. Your mind stays on the object no matter what. If you tell it you're going to sit down for 1 hour and I'm going to focus on my breath, my mind's going to stay on my breath for that full hour. I'm not going to lose track of it once. At that point, you probably don't have to count anymore. You can just focus on the breath, on the sensation. But you do need to have introspection. What introspection is, it's a piece of your mind that's sort of, although 99% of your mind's on the breath, 99% of the time, there's like 1% of your mind is kind of monitoring. And it's asking, it's looking and saying, well, every now and then it's checking. It's not doing it constantly. You're not constantly checking. But it's every now and then intermittently checking, am I still on the breath or not? And what can happen at this level is what's called subtle distraction comes in. So, and this starts to come in with you see a new animal who appears around, looks like stage 1, 2, 3, 4. You see a new animal in there? Little bunny rabbit on the back of the elephant. And the bunny rabbit also, so the bunny rabbit, he eventually disappears. He changes color too. The bunny rabbit represents a subtle distraction. Subtle distraction is very interesting because now your mind stays on the object, but you're able to do what we're all experts at in the West, in the US, in the modern world, and that is multitasking. You stay on the breath the whole time for the whole hour, and you're all happy with yourself. You're proud. You no longer lose the object. But while you're focusing on your breath, you're also thinking about what's that side dish for the burrito. You can do both at once. So you're focused, but you're not 100% focused. So there's what's called subtle distraction or excitement. So that's another thing that you're trying to get a hold of as you go up through these stages. So you're taking care of two things. One is coarse distraction, and then eventually subtle distraction. So you're getting your mind more and more and that takes introspection because, again, you can be fooled into thinking, oh, look at me, I sat down for an entire hour and I was on my breath the whole time. Yes, but how much of your mind was on that breath the whole time? Was there a part of it that wasn't really there? That wasn't really alert? It wasn't really awake and hyper alert and focused? So that's one. And also with coarse laxity, so coarse laxity or dullness is a state where your mind is at the coarser level, you literally fall asleep. But as it gets subtler and subtler, the coarser level of laxity is a very tricky thing. It's where your mind actually kind of sinks into the object, and if you want to say, it's almost like it falls asleep into the object. You almost merge too much with the object. And that's actually probably one of the biggest dangers, and it's so important, actually, that particular topic, that I'll read a couple passages from here because I think it's something that's not understood well enough, and a lot of meditators get maybe middle level in their practice, and they tend to fall into this trap of falling into subtle laxity and confuse that as being equated with meditation. So, for example, on page 68 of this book, Genla Rinpa says, if you don't concern yourself with the strength of clarity, this is the clarity of the object, there's a whole bunch of discussions about the remedies you use when you notice one of these problems is occurring. There's different things you do to pull yourself. You're trying to get your mind balanced, essentially. If you sink in too much, that's a problem. If your mind goes out too much, that's a problem. You're trying to get it to stay right in the middle and be awake and alert and clear and strong on the object that you're putting your mind on. So if you don't concern yourself with the strength of clarity, you'll find that stability is more easily maintained. So you don't concern yourself too much. Again, one of the obstacles is having an introspective consciousness, get too involved, like a helicopter parent. If it's too involved, it actually disturbs your meditation as well. You have to kind of get that balance right. He's sort of referring to that here. There's a well-known Buddhist aphorism that can be easily misinterpreted, and the aphorism is, quote, "The best relaxation is the best meditation." That's the quote. If you take that literally, you can ascend to the heights of laxity and confuse. So the best relaxation is the best meditation. If you take that too literally, you can ascend to the heights of laxity and confuse that state of laxity, which does have stability, for proper meditation. This would be a faulty approach. Because an essential attribute of laxity is lack of clarity, it does not provide the basis for gaining higher and higher realizations. The quality of mind upon full awakening is one of extraordinary lucidity and clarity. That is the end product. If you're cultivating laxity, notice he says if you're cultivating laxity, your clarity will be on a downward path, which clearly indicates that you're not going towards full awakening. Simply and directly, the way to dispel a faulty approach is to be on guard for laxity, particularly subtle laxity, and to apply antidotes the moment you see it arise. So notice he says that if you're cultivating laxity, there's another quote or two in here I'm going to read you that's to the same effect. What I didn't find right now before this talk, there's a quote in here, I just couldn't find it, where he actually talks about it's very dangerous to do this. And in fact, what you're doing, if you start to get good at this, literally cultivating subtle laxity, you kind of, it's almost zoning, it's like spacing out or trancing out into the object, and it feels really good. It's almost like getting a little bit intoxicated or something. You're kind of like merging into the object, and it feels nice and cozy and comfy, and you just merge into it and hang out there. And it's actually a form of subtle laxity you're actually cultivating. And there's a point in here where he says many people mistake that for developing meditation, and they start to develop that, they start to cultivate that. And what you're actually cultivating is subtle laxity. You're getting better and better and better at that, and that's, hate to say it, but he says it in here, that's actually creating the cause for being reborn as an animal. So you're kind of not doing what you want to be doing. Another quote to a similar effect is here at the end, page 118. Okay, this is actually where he's talking about something else. No, I don't want that one. We will come back to that. Yeah, here's the other one on page 134. 134. Okay, I'm going to back up onto 133. And this is in the question and answer phase. So a student asks, in the sixth mental state of the different stages here, when we succumb to subtle laxity again and subtle excitement, is that because it's so subtle that we aren't able to recognize it immediately, or is it because we fail to apply the appropriate antidote? Again, he's discussed throughout here, what are the antidotes you apply? There's different techniques, again, techniques that you apply. They can be techniques as subtle as, for example, you notice yourself on a very subtle level falling asleep, you stop temporarily your focus on your breath, and you focus on a very bright light in a particular part in your body, or there's different things you can do just temporarily to kind of wake yourself back up, then you go back to the object. Or if in a more extreme case, you might splash water on your face, or you might actually stand up and sit back down. So the specific antidotes you apply, and once the antidote's done its job, you stop applying it and you go right back to your practice. So the student's asking, is it that we don't recognize it, or is it because we're not applying the antidotes? And the answer he gives is, both can still arise. That's subtle laxity and subtle excitement. And at that stage, subtle excitement is easier to recognize than subtle laxity. So again, here's the subtle laxity problem. The greatest danger is that you are so involved in concentration that you may simply not care about the arising of subtle laxity. It doesn't appear to be harmful at all. Your concentration is stable. It appears to be great, so you can say, so what? Who cares? When you fail to apply the antidote, this is to subtle laxity now, what happens is that you think you're practicing concentration, but you're in fact practicing concentration mixed with subtle laxity. You can continue in that state for a long time and feel perfectly wonderful, but it will totally disintegrate your practice. It's said that you can stay in this state for 7 days and 7 nights in a single session. That would be impressive. I'd feel I was doing pretty well if I was able to do that. Your senses are shut down and you don't see anything. You don't hear anything, so it's easy to congratulate yourself and think, I've arrived. Notice your senses have shut down. This thing about keeping your eyes open is really important. If you close your eyes, you're going to fall asleep, whether you do on a coarse level or on a subtle level. Keeping your eyes open, sort of not focused on anything, just sort of gazing in front of you as you're doing this kind of thing. At a certain point when your focus is good enough, you actually aren't seeing anymore. And you've probably all had this experience where you're so lost in thought or something that you're kind of like your eyes are open, but you don't even see what's right in front of you because you're so. That's actually a form of concentration where you're just not invested in your senses. Or likewise with sounds. We know that when we go to sleep at night, we have dreams, we shut off our sense of hearing, right? So if your mind is concentrated enough on an object, your senses shut down. That happens even at an intermediate stage. That's what he's saying here. So, but you can even do that for 7 days and 7 nights. You think you've arrived. And he says then, well, you may have arrived, but unfortunately, you went somewhere you didn't want to go. Subtle laxity is still there, and it will continue to be there unless you are on guard for it with the introspection. It arises in both the 6th and 7th mental states. Even in the 7th, if you don't apply the antidotes, it can still arise. The danger is still there. So, and again, somewhere else he talks about this even leading to rebirth as an animal, because you're cultivating a certain kind of state that's a very subtle kind of asleep state. It's not focused. It's a fake. It's an almost focus, but not quite there. So this is really quite tricky. The top stages where you're getting past subtle laxity and subtle excitement is quite difficult. Well, let's just talk about it. As you go all the way to the very top, then at the very top, towards the top scenes, you can see the monk is now leading the elephant. He's in charge of his mind. His mind is following him. The rabbit disappears, and then in the up way at the top, the monkey actually disappears. And at the very top, the monk's in charge of his mind. The elephant's totally white. There's zero laxity, and there's also zero distraction. And at the very top left corner, you have it's very sweet. You have the elephant, his own mind, just actually curling up and sleeping next to him. And this is almost shamatha then. Shamatha then, you'll notice at the very top, he's actually riding the elephant, and you see him flying in space. There's a whole thing that happens after you've attained, or once you've attained shamatha, where it's interesting because although this isn't tantra, it uses a similar physiology. There's a notion of sort of energy within your body that becomes so subtle and so supple that you get this experience of extreme bliss, actually, and also an experience of extreme suppleness, like your body feels and your mind feels like Superman, like you could do anything, like you could literally fly in the air. So you get a physical experience of, they call it pliancy, a kind of like a fluidity in your body, and also a sense of mental agility that's just incredible. And so it's as if you're flying. And then it's important, interesting, also at the top, he's actually, you'll see, coming back. In the very top right corner, he's coming back. So he's not just going off. This is the way you go into, after this, once you've attained shamatha. Shamatha is a prerequisite for now attaining the 4 you've perhaps heard of in Buddhist cosmology, the 4 form realms and formless realms. This is the entry point. It's once you've attained shamatha, now you can go into the 4 form realms and 4 formless realms, which are states of very rarefied meditative concentration. They have qualities. It's not just sort of blanking out. They're specific experiences. And they're also realms. They're considered realms within samsara. They're God realms. They're places. That's how you get born into one of these sort of God realms. It's really a trance state. They're useful states to cultivate. Buddhists do cultivate them, but they don't cultivate them as an end goal. They're not considered ends in themselves. And significantly, they are not equivalent to nirvana. They're not even necessarily simulacra or similitudes of nirvana. But they are useful states to cultivate. But you actually come back down, you go through them, you also now have to cultivate vipassana. So the monk coming back sort of represents that he's not just going off into like bliss land now. He's going to come back into the world and engage with people socially and compassionately, but also come back and engage in vipassana now as well. Trying to think, there was one other point I wanted to make about this, but now it'll come back to me. So these are the other point I wanted to make is that it's sort of good news, bad news, or it's, let's say, sobering news. Sobering news. And the sobering news is, the good news is any amount of progress you make, again, Wallace has written many books on this, both from a scholarly point of view as well as a practicing point of view. As he wrote another book called Attention Revolution, sort of trying to get this into schools. This is good for anybody. This kind of practice can transform anybody's life. And you don't have to be a Buddhist. There's nothing even religious about this, right? This is just a skill that you develop. It's not the same as mindfulness, and that's a whole different topic we can discuss if you want. I think mindfulness is also very much misunderstood and misappropriated from Buddhist practices. If you want to read a great book on that, it just came out a year or two ago. It's called What's Wrong with Mindfulness? And then the subtitle is And What Isn't? And it's written by, I think, 12 or 14 Buddhist scholar practitioners, right? I don't like the division between scholars. Yeah, there are people who are scholars and they don't practice, and there are people who practice but aren't scholars, but the the norm, as we discussed last week, the Nalanda norm is that you're both, right? So rather than thinking it's like either or, one's better than the other, it's no, you do both. 12 to 14 scholar practitioners who write about, in other words, they're well informed by the tradition. They also are well informed in terms of the practice, and they write about how the mindfulness movement that, as we know, is taken off right now, has been really sort of watered down and mischaracterized and misappropriated in all sorts of ways that are not good. But if it's done properly, there's all kinds of ways in which it is good. So that's what's wrong with mindfulness and what isn't, right? Same with shamatha, same with this kind of thing. Any amount of practice that you do is going to be very good and very helpful and make your life better just on a normal, everyday level. That's the good news. The sobering news is that to go all the way up to level 9 shamatha and attain what they're talking about here is incredibly difficult, incredibly rare. You're not going to do it with a half an hour every morning for the next 3 years. Even if you go out on a retreat for 2 years and do nothing but this, it's considered very, very difficult to attain 9th level shamatha, or beyond the 9th level in shamatha. So it's not super common for people. It's not like, oh, great, I see the 9 stages. They've written about it. They talk about it. It must be a thing that people do. Maybe I can do it in a few months, or maybe I'll take that retreat for 2 years. Even if you do that, it's considered difficult. It's still worth trying, because you're working with your mind, right? You're getting better and better at developing the ability to get your mind to be totally focused and honing in on subtle laxity and subtle distraction. It's definitely worth moving in that direction, but you don't want to fool yourself into thinking, oh, it's going to be a cakewalk, or it's going to be a few years and I'm going to be there. So that's kind of the two sides of the news I wanted to share with you in terms of this. So I guess I can see a hand going up here, and it's now 8:18. So we can discuss. I'll stop there and certainly have some conversation and questions and answers. And if people online want to chat in, whoever's back there monitoring the computer can let me know questions coming in from online. And if you want, we can unpack any one of these topics further. So yes.
Sure. Do we know anybody who's got almost to the last stage at least?
Well, there's certainly in throughout Buddhist history, there's lots and lots of examples of people who do. It's considered more difficult to do nowadays, not because we're bad Westerners or something. It's just it actually has to do with the environment in part, to find the conditions, the proper conditions, where it's quiet. Even if you have a quiet retreat somewhere, just sort of psychically, that 7 billion people and climate change and air jets flying over and pollution, and it's difficult to get the conditions, let alone to take a leave of absence and from your family and your job to go off for 2 years. So it's considered much more difficult. So there's fewer and fewer examples today of people doing this. The other problem is, as you probably know, or the catch-22 is in terms of answering that, is it's considered part of a Buddhist ethical norm, we'll discuss that next week, to not brag about or advertise your spiritual attainments. So you're not going to go around saying, oh yeah, I attained shamatha 6 months ago, here's my card, You don't do that. So there probably are experienced meditators who have achieved that, but it's considered not something that they're going to run around and advertise. It's also different. That's even more the case in Tantra. You don't go advertising tantric accomplishments. There's all sorts of reasons for that. And it's tantric practice, actually, that most people, as you probably know, within the Tibetan tradition, that the Indo-Tibetan tradition that the Dalai Lama is associating himself with, at a more advanced level, they're going to be practicing Tantra, for sure. And in Tantra, that's where you're combining the shamatha and vipassana the way I mentioned a little while ago. And it's a profoundly powerful practice, not only because you're combining shamatha and vipassana at the same time and accelerating both, but also because your ability to progress is quicker. So if we look at tantric theory, you're getting into higher stages of creation stage yoga, where you can visualize an entire mandala with all the details, all the deities in every single detail, and you can see the pupils of all the eyes of the deities who you're all associating with, and take that entirely incredibly complex visualization down to the size of a mustard seed and have it in every detail for 4 hours. Now you're graduating out of creation stage into perfection stage. At that point, you've got shamatha by definition, but shamatha in a tantric context.
So,
But again, you're not going to advertise that.
so there is known people like that
Yeah, there are, well,
in our time.
there are. There's certainly, there are plenty of lamas. I mean, anybody would probably say that the Dalai Lama is one such person for sure, and other lamas who are qualified tantric masters are going to have this ability. One thing we didn't discuss, but I'll just sort of throw it out there before I forget, is that because it's a related topic and it's very important to sort of know this, obviously what we're doing today, we're not meditating. I don't know if you were hoping that we're going to practice, but I am trying to arm you with some information so that you can go on your own if you choose to, if you're interested, and like pursue practicing some form of cultivation if you want. One of the forms of meditation is very, very popularly taught these days also is Dzogchen, and an important book there that I like very much, 2 of them, but one again by the Dalai Lama. This one's called Dzogchen, the Heart Essence of Great Perfection. People don't oftentimes associate the Dalai Lama, who's considered, sort of the Gelugpa tradition. Dzogchen is considered an Nyingma practice. Many of you probably do know this, but some of you may not know that the Dalai Lamas are very much connected with Nyingma practice as well. They have been for many, many generations. So it's not that the Nyingma Pas are like have a monopoly on Dzogchen. And so the Dalai Lama has many important Nyingma teachers who've taught him Dzogchen. He's considered Dzogchen one of the practices he does. And this particular book, actually, he gave 4 different conferences or whatever, where he was present with Dzogchen masters and so forth, Soga Rinpoche and others. And at each of these 4 different conferences, they wrote down, they transcribed it, and this is a synopsis of important aspects of those 4. The other book he wrote on Dzogchen, his own book, is called Mind in Comfort and Ease, the Vision of Enlightenment and the Great Perfection. Great Perfection is the translation of Dzogchen. What this practice is, again, just so you know, is it's impossible to summarize it in 2 seconds, but basically it's a kind of practice that is, if you're sort of just introduced to it, you're introduced to this notion of you're going to focus on the nature of your mind being empty and clear and pure and spontaneous. And it's considered, actually Genla Rinpa discusses this in this book without calling it Dzogchen, but it's not the same, but it's a very similar idea. Of all the objects you can choose to focus on when you're doing shamatha, when you're doing this, you can focus on your breath, that's an easy one, or you can focus on a blue flower, a visualized blue flower. You can focus on a visual image of a Buddha in front of you or on your head, which is sort of moving in the tantric direction of visualizing a Buddha body. The other thing you can do is actually use your mind itself as your object of concentration. So you use your mind. Now what is your mind? Well, it's some sort of bare awareness, right? So the fact that you have this mind is kind of a weird thing because your mind is now using itself as its object. And so what he says in here, and what's said in many books on shamatha, is that if you can do that, that's great. That's awesome. That has some profound benefits. But it's extremely difficult to do. This is like for really somebody who's maybe got some experience from a past lifetime or something, or for some reason they've got some real amazing abilities. It's extremely difficult to use your mind as the object of itself. Doing Dzogchen meditation is something like that, and he discusses that in this book. And what he discusses in this book at great length is the many pitfalls and misunderstandings of Dzogchen. Dzogchen is something like that, where you're just resting in the nature of the mind, you're focusing on that itself. Very, very difficult to do. It's considered, within the Nyingma system, they talk about 9 vehicles. It's the 9th, it's the highest level. What's not advertised as often, sometimes in Dzogchen teachings, it's not advertised that you're really supposed to go all through the other 8. This is not the same in 9 here, it's totally different. But it has to do with the Hinayana and Mahayana and actually the other 3 levels of tantric practice. You're actually doing lower tantras in creation and perfection stage, and Dzogchen is actually probably a variant of Dzogrim, which means perfection stage. It's up at that level. It's not just something you do, it's the easy, quick way to enlightenment. It's formless, I don't have to do all this deity stuff and rituals, I can just go straight for the good stuff. So it's very profound. It's definitely a completely amazing, legitimate part of the whole tradition, but it's very, very advanced, and it's not just easily done. So it's good to be forearmed as well, and if you want to read up on that, I would recommend this book. But so in terms of you're asking about masters, other masters, Dzogchen masters, any of the people who are considered Dzogchen masters are people who have attained shamatha using the mind, but also penetrated to the nature of the mind, what they call rigpa. It's like a bare, pristine awareness, which isn't, it has certain qualities to it of luminescence and bliss and so forth, the nature of the mind does. But somebody's actually directly experienced that at a deep level. So there's definitely people out there, but they're not a dime a dozen. It's not like, you go to your local Dharma center and there's, 30 Western students, and they're like, well, let me find the 2 who've been there for the last 20 years. At least one of them has attained shamatha. Maybe not. Maybe, but not necessarily. But again, it's what's more important, obviously, is sort of knowing the map and knowing what's possible and moving in that direction. That's kind of what's important. Yes?
Would it be a little easier for you to observe the activity of your mind as the meditative object if you were really occupied doing something? Because I experimented with this once when I was driving a cab.
Interesting.
And you have all kinds of things
Sure.
going on. And so you have so many of these things. It's so vivid
Right.
that if you could just pull back a little bit and just observe it, it's always there.
You can do something like that. In other words, there's 2 aspects involved here, mindfulness and introspection. You can be practicing those skills, mindfulness and introspection, while you're driving a cab or while you're playing a musical instrument or while you're playing tennis or doing an activity. Right. Yes, and you certainly can develop those skills of greater mindfulness and greater introspection. You're not going to probably, and that's important, just to develop those skills in and of themselves. And you can get into, we've known in now, I can never pronounce his name, Sistek Mihaly, this notion of a flow state. This we've probably, many of you have heard of this notion of being in a flow state where you're so, he writes about this by looking at musicians and athletes and people who get so in the groove or in the flow because they're so focused and like the rest of the world turns off. That certainly is an indication of developing greater and greater levels of mindfulness and introspection. You're probably not going to develop shamatha itself when you're doing an activity like that. This does require, they even say in terms of the prerequisites, it requires an actual retreat where it's quiet, your food's taken care of, like all sort of external necessities are taken care of, and you can really focus. This is, again, when we normally say meditation, imagine what that means. It means that's what this is. But again, the term meditation or bhavana is a huge spectrum. It's not just sitting super quiet, focused, etc. But if you're doing shamatha, you're going to be doing this in a very focused, quiet setting. You're not going to be doing it driving a cab. But to the extent to which you've done this, certainly when you go out and drive your cab or you play your instrument or do whatever activity, the benefits of this come and impact and inform your daily activities, definitely.
Oh, yeah. I see. It increases the propensity to
Yes, it does. And your ability to be focused and mindful and alert and so forth. I mean, a lot of things occur in terms of we mentioned the physical pliancy, the sort of energy, the prana changes. Other things occur, even they say when you get to that point, if you do attain shamatha, one of the byproducts, is sort of an accidental byproduct, is a level of clairvoyance even. Level of clairvoyance. The person who's attained shamatha, their mind is so 100% in control that they're able to have their mind just be totally calm in the presence of others. And what will happen is, so they say, is you'll be in the presence of others and suddenly you'll hear a thought, you'll hear a sentence, and you know it's not your mind. And you recognize, oh, that was your thought I just picked up on. So you actually start to develop a level of clairvoyance. It's sort of an automatic byproduct, which is then something you can develop. And in a Mahayana context, that's considered a bodhisattva skill. Obviously you can be a better bodhisattva. It helps your skillful means, helps your art, your ability to compassionately intervene and help others. If you could read people's minds, it would be a helpful tool. It can be misused, but it can also be used properly by a bodhisattva. So it's like a siddhi. It's like an accomplishment or a power that is developed.
Yes, thank you. This may seem like a very simple question, but I really have had a hard time with concept of all things Tantra and Tantric. Can you please,
What is it?
Yes. I'm just not getting it.
I would say that I think one of the most helpful summaries to kind of keep in mind is to look at what the word Tantra means and then to expand upon that. And what the word Tantra itself means, or in Tibetan, Gyu, it means continuum, continuity or continuum. And so what Tantra is looking at is it's looking at the continuity or the continuum, or to use a fancy term, there's like a homological, there's a homology, to use a biological term. There's a homological relationship between your body and your mind now, and what a purified body-mind, namely a Buddha, is. So becoming a Buddha, becoming a fully awakened being, and by the way, this is the reason for Buddhi, or Buddha, I like the term, it literally means awakened. And I like that as better than enlightenment, personally, because A, it's a literal translation, but B, what happens when you awaken? I think we tend to think of enlightenment or Buddhahood as some sort of a cognitive, like, aha, like, I get it now. Like it's this mental cognitive breakthrough. It is that, but it's equally physical, it's equally somatic, it's psycho and somatic. And when you think about why did the Buddha use that term? I mean, he coined the term. He said, I'm Buddha, I'm awoken. When you wake up literally from sleep, we know that you have a profound mental shift. Suddenly, in your dream, you were on a yacht in the Bahamas, right? And suddenly you wake up and you're in your apartment in Manhattan. So your mental reality shifts, but so does your physical reality. Your entire physical experience changes dramatically when you physically wake up. So it's a psychophysical shift, right? So that's why I like awakening for Buddhi. But what the state that we're in now, which is a state of sleep, a state of, they call it being an alienated individual. That's the term for a non-awakened being, is an alienated individual. We're alienated from our true nature, which is actually like the Buddha nature. So there's a continuity there. It's not that you're becoming something else, like you're suddenly becoming a crocodile or becoming a Martian or I don't know what. You're not becoming something unlike what you already are. You're actually becoming what you actually are already. In a sense, there's a way in which your Buddha nature, both mind and body, there's a physical continuity and a cognitive or mental continuity between the state we're in now and the state that's awakened. So the tantric vehicle, it's called the tantric vehicle because these are all vehicles, right? The Mahayana, the universal vehicle, the Hinayana, the individual vehicle, Tantrayana. It's called a vehicle. It's the continuum vehicle. Why is that? Because another term for the tantric vehicle is the effect vehicle, or literally the fruit vehicle, the Palayana, which is contrasted with the Bodhisattva yana, where you're doing the 6 perfections, which is called the cause vehicle. So only in juxtaposition, when Tantric Buddhists or Vajrayana Buddhists refer to themselves as the effect vehicle, they're now doing that in contradistinction to calling regular Mahayana Buddhism the cause vehicle. So why is it called the effect vehicle? Because you're taking the effect, right? A vehicle, a spiritual path or a spiritual vehicle is going to take you from where you are to somewhere better, right? Hopefully. So it's called the effect vehicle because you're actually taking the effect which you want, which is Buddhahood, and instead of projecting it out there a million lifetimes in the future, you're taking that state as your vehicle. In other words, you're assuming the state of the goal right now. In Tantric Buddhism, and why can you do that? Is it just a fantasy? And they talk a lot about this in the Tantric text. The reason it's not just a fantasy is because there's a continuum there. It's like collapsing space-time, right? So when you attain Buddhahood at some point in the future, you recognize retroactively that you always were a Buddha in some sense. Just like when you wake up from a nightmare. You know, it's still you, but it's like you realize, oh, that was an illusion. The nightmare I was having, it was real, it was me, but it was very distorted. But it's still, there's a continuity there, right? Mind and body. So here, the methods that are used in Tantra, rather than creating the causes for Buddhahood, which takes many, many lifetimes, or at least many years, within one lifetime if you're lucky, you're still doing that. You're still incorporating cause-vehicle practices like generosity and ethics and patience and so forth. But you're also adding to that this notion of taking the effect, the final effect of Buddhahood, and using that in the path right now by assuming that to be the case now, which you'll notice is exactly what I described as deity yoga a minute ago. Mind cognizing emptiness arising or appearing or perceiving itself in the form of a Buddha. So you're actually in that practice, in a sadhana practice, in a tantric practice, you dissolve your normal ego identity into emptiness. You just completely dissolve it, and then that cognitive state of emptiness re-arises in the form of a Buddha, which you now identify with. It's my new identity. That's who I am. And so the definition of, I gave you the definition of deity yoga before, which is the mind cognizing emptiness arising in the form of a deity. The purpose of doing deity yoga is twofold, is to develop vivid perception and divine pride, or Buddha pride. Vivid perception means you see the deity, you see the Buddha form vividly. This is shamatha. This is, you see it vividly, so there's no laxity, there's clarity, there's stability. You vividly see the form of the female Buddha Tara, or the male-female in union of Guhya Samadhi or Kala Chakra. Whatever your deity form is, you see it absolutely vividly and stably, right? And if the mind that's doing that is not a normal small little ego, it's like me, but it's like this empty, selfless self, and that becomes your identity, you actually develop what they call Buddha pride. Buddha pride's a funny term because you think, well, pride, that's not a good thing. But a Buddha has the pride of not being a self. The Buddha has the pride of being a Buddha that's not a Buddha, not a Buddha, right? It's not like big ego Buddha. It's empty Buddha. So you're developing two things, vivid perception and divine pride, or Buddha pride they call it. That means you're actually seeing yourself as you're identifying, your principal identity is your Buddha nature, your Buddhahood, as opposed to your principal identity being this crummy samsaric being who's such a loser and just tries hard but can't seem to get it to work, which is how most of us think of ourselves if we're honest most of the time. That they have a term for that. It's called, and this is a big theme within tantric practice, it's called the pride of ordinariness. It's actually over-identifying with I'm such a schlub, I'm just, And it's actually the pride of ordinariness is used within a tantric context, is critiqued as being something that we use as an excuse for not making progress, actually. Why am I not as compassionate as I could be? Well, because I'm just such a schmuck, I'd like to be more compassionate, but he really just pisses me off when this happens, and so my anger just gets the better of me, and whatever. And I allow myself to be that way because I identify with what a limited being I am. In a tantric context, it's like, no, you're going to take the effect, the possibility of Buddhahood as being your nature now, because again, the continuity, the term tantra means continuity. Take that as your path. Identify and live up to being a Buddha right now. Now, that sounds good in practice, but that's what the practice is. I mean, just because you do that one day in a sadhana doesn't mean suddenly that's true. But you're using that imagination, that imaginative capacity to identify yourself with being a Buddha, which is not a total pipe dream or a fantasy. It's connected with reality, it's just you're not really there yet, right? But because it's connected, it's not totally fantasy, and you're using that as a method to get there more quickly.
Wouldn't that rewrite your neural pathways?
Yes, it rewrites your neural pathways. It rewrites everything. It rewrites your whole processing of who you are and who you think you are. That's exactly what you're doing.
But isn't that when other people would say you're crazy, though?
They could, and so you have to. This is why the emptiness piece of it. No, they write a lot about this. This is why you don't do tantric practice unless you have at least a good conceptual, and preferably some experiential understanding of emptiness, and also your motivation is bodhicitta, compassion and altruism, that's your motivation. There's a number of criteria, but those are like two of the key criteria. So the criteria of the emptiness piece means that you're not just like psychotically suddenly thinking you're something you're not. Tsongkhapa talks about this in his Great Stages of the Path of Mantra, where he talks about, quoting from texts in India, people who critique it saying, well, just because you imagine you're a king doesn't mean you're a king, right? And so they discuss this topic in that kind of a context. A crazy person, right, a psychotic person thinks he's a king and goes around thinking he's a king, and he's not a king. Everybody knows he's not a king, but he thinks he is. He's wondering why isn't everybody like bowing at his feet, right? Well, the problem there is there's not a continuity. You're not a king. To be a king means you're within a social context where you have a certain blood lineage or whatever. Everybody thinks you're a king. There's a reality status possibility to being a king or not. That's a disconnect. That's being psychotic. Imagining that you're a Buddha from an emptiness perspective it's not psychotic if it's informed by emptiness, because the emptiness piece of it, first of all, there is a continuity there. There is a real possibility of being a Buddha, whereas the beggar is not. There's no real possibility of being a king. So you're already a Buddha actually in a certain way. It's just you're not developed. It's like you're an embryo. The term Tathagata can mean Buddha nature. It can also mean Buddha embryo. It can also mean Buddha womb, the womb of the Buddha. It can mean any of those. But just like you're a baby Buddha right now. Just haven't grown up yet. Right? They talk about bodhisattvas. They say a bodhisattva, a synonym for a bodhisattva, which is a person who's training to become a Buddha, is a son or a daughter of the Buddhas. So it's like a Buddha child, right? You're not there yet, but you're on your way. You're working your way towards adolescence and eventually full Buddhahood. So there is a continuity there. But yes, it becomes psychotic or megalomaniac or something if you now think, oh, I used to think I was just ordinary crummy Tom, but now I know I'm really a Buddha. That's taking one smaller identity, ego, that thinks it's independent and now projecting into a bigger ego. I'm a bigger, better Buddha, and that's super problematic. That gets you into real trouble real fast. So yeah, it's considered a danger, and that's one of the reasons among several why Tantra is considered esoteric or secret. It's not just for public consumption. You have to have a fair amount of background understanding and experience, actually quite a bit, before taking the effect as your path will be efficacious, can work. One of the other things that's necessary is to have a lama, a guru, a mentor, a guide who follows you through this practice. That's essential. You can't just do it on your own. And partly because of this, because there's so many dangers and pitfalls. But anyway, in brief, it's hard to say what is Tantra in brief, but that's my best brief answer. It means continuum, continuity, and it means the effect vehicle. Yes?
Thank you, Professor Yarnall. Thank you for these comments. I studied with Professor Thurman at Columbia years ago, and your work
great.
is orbiting our work during that time. Thank you. So you're speaking about all this. We've all been at this many lives. That's why we're sitting here again together. And you're speaking, and I'm hearing you warning against the laxity, and my feeling was that the Heart Sutra just kept coming to me, and this idea that there's nothing to attain. There is no attainment.
Right.
So if you could just speak about that with respect to the pitfalls and the warnings.
Sure. I think it's helpful, again, to sort of take one little soundbite, like we're giving some different sound bites today. That's part of my goal, or part of what's motivating me, is to give some sound bites or information to take away, because I only get to be with you for 2 hours and maybe 2 hours next week. And I've been at this for 40 years and seen and been victim myself of many of these pitfalls and seen other people. And so I have a little bit of a sense of, and I've read enough, in the texts in Tibetan and Sanskrit to know that these are common pitfalls. It's not just us modern Westerners. They're written about a lot in all of the different texts. And so I think it's helpful to share this. But in terms of that, there is no attainment. A nice soundbite is to remember in the Heart Sutra and in the longer Prajnaparamita Sutras, of which the Heart Sutra is an extract or a condensation, there is no attainment, but there's also no non-attainment. So remember that. There is no self, but there's also no non-self. It's both and, or it's either or. It's not that you just have no self, you have no intrinsic self. When they talk about no attainment, anytime they say in any of these sort of transcendent wisdom contexts, they say no fill in the blank, you have no 5 skandhas, right, in the Heart Sutra. No eye, no ear, no tongue, no this skandha, no that skandha, no nothing. It always means no intrinsic. You can always fill in the blank. And in the longer Prajnaparamita Sutras, that blank is filled in. So if you take the longer ones, the 8,000 or particularly the 20, 25,000 or 100,000 verses, you have no intrinsic or no objective body, no objective mind, no intrinsic mind. You do have a conventional mind. You do have a relative mind. You do have a relative this, a relative that. Relatively speaking, you do attain X, Y, Z, conventionally speaking. But when it's put down super concisely, they just say no. And one of the reasons they just say no, and you get this in Madhyamaka texts as well, is a little bit of a shock value. It kind of like snaps you out of something. But for example, Chandrakirti notes in his Madhyamaka texts, analyzing the Prajnaparamita Sutras, that for we normal sentient beings who haven't gone through this kind of analysis yet, the only kind of reality that we've ever even thought of or seen is intrinsic reality. So if we say the table exists, that could only mean intrinsically exists. We don't even add the modifier intrinsically because that's just built, it's obvious, that's just built in. We only see intrinsic realities or objective realities. That's all we see. That's intuitively. You don't have to be a philosopher. You can be a gerbil. A gerbil just sees objective intrinsic realities. That's what they see. So for a gerbil or for us, normal sentient beings, to exist means to exist intrinsically or objectively or independently. That's what it means. So to say, no, it doesn't exist, it's like throwing out, is it throwing out the baby in the bathwater? Not exactly, but it's saying, the Heart Sutra is right to say, you have no body. Because the kind of having a body that you think you have, or the kind of attainment you think you could have, that type which is infused with objective independent status, no, that you don't have. Now if you want to get more nuanced about it, let's get more nuanced. We say you don't have an objective independent XYZ. Your normal person doesn't know what I just said. It's like, what do you mean, independent? What are you talking about? Once you analyze that and then you can start to be more nuanced and say, okay, this is the two truths, right? The two reality system or the two truth system in Buddhism, ultimate truth and relative truth, and the fact that they equate to each other. Emptiness and relativity equate. You don't have an independent self, you do have a relative self. Those are simultaneously the same, actually. To see emptiness is to see relativity, etc. So the Heart Sutra is coming down on the no side because it's hitting at the objective side. It's saying, no, you don't have the objective independent, without filling in the other side of the equation. It's harping on that sort of as a strong medicine. And it's true, it's a dangerous medicine because if all you do is walk away, if that's all you hear and you walk away, then you think, oh, then you become a nihilist. You just think, well, nothing exists, I don't exist, my body doesn't exist, tables don't exist, attainment doesn't exist, I might as well just, nothing exists, I might as well jump off a bridge, end it all right now. And that the possibility of misunderstanding emptiness in a nihilistic way is considered another real danger. And so the antidote to that danger is that's why I put it up here. You know, remember, emptiness means relativity. It means interdependent origination, etc. It means you don't objectively exist. Are there any? Oh, our computer person's gone. So I don't know if the computer person comes back. We'll see if there's anybody online who's been chatting in with questions, screaming through the internet. Yes?
Just a question. Where does dream yoga fit in as part of the object factor?
Yeah.
And what is Mahamudra? I've heard that term too.
Sure. Well, those are two big questions, Mahamudra and dream yoga. I mean, in brief, if you look up, there's books on this as well. The 6 yogas of Naropa, for example, dream yoga is one of those 6. But it's associated with Naropa, but it's not only Naropa. These 6 yogas are part of all the different systems, tantric systems from India and throughout all 4 orders of Tibetan Buddhism. So it's not just a Kagyupa thing. But dream yoga is one of the 6 yogas. It's more related to perfection stage yoga. It's moving in the direction of, it's related to deity yoga. It's priming yourself. It's learning to lucidly dream. It's also priming yourself to be able to be aware of deep sleep, but also dream and eventually the bardo. It's also, so you're learning to actually, if you can imagine lucidly dreaming, if you've ever had a lucid dream, that's where you're in a dream and you suddenly realize you're dreaming, and you're very clear that you're dreaming. Usually when that happens, you wake up. That's what happens. But every now and then, if you're lucky, you have a lucid dream where you're aware that you're dreaming and yet you keep dreaming. And it becomes like this magical thing. It's like, wow, I can fly, I can do. And maybe to some extent you can start to have fun or do some magical things in your dream because you're in control of the dream. Dream yoga is like learning to do that. And to do that to be awake in the dream and to actually start to take control and do things in the dream. And similar to deity yoga, you're starting to learn, so you start to manifest Buddha forms and so forth in your dream. And eventually it can enhance a perfection stage practice called illusory body or magic body, where your actual energy body actually becomes one of these deity forms. Initially it's just in imagination. That's the difference between creation stage and perfection stage. In perfection stage yoga, you actually are becoming that. Your energy body is actually taking the form of one of these Buddha beings. So dream yoga is sort of working in that direction, in that vein. And Mahamudra is something similar to Dzogchen. It's the Great Seal. It's a term for an advanced stage. It's sort of like a perfection stage practice also, where you're really directly recognizing the nature of the mind on a very deep level, the clear light nature of the mind. And so, again, Mahamudra is sometimes presented, it should be presented within a tantric context only. There was a big debate about this in Tibet a bunch of centuries ago as to whether there's exoteric and esoteric. Really, Mahamudra should be within a tantric context, and it relates to the recognition of the clear light nature of the mind. And it's something that, like with Dzogchen, it can sound super simple and appealing, because like, oh, I can do that, you know. I don't have to do all this other stuff. It's like, actually, no, it really comes at the culmination of all that other stuff. It is kind of one of the end goals, but it's not something you just do without doing any preparation. So Mahamudra, you can sort of look at it as being related to Dzogchen in that sense. It has to do with recognizing on a very deep level, the clear light nature of the mind. Which at that deep level, by the way, at the tantric, when you're looking at tantric sort of metaphysics, at the subtlest level, the subtle level of the mind, which is the clear light nature of the mind, is indistinguishable. You can't separate it from the extremely subtle body, which is actually like an energy of bliss. So they have an extremely subtle, and then a subtle, and then a coarse, body and mind both. So at the very subtlest level, we are all like a bliss. We're a body of bliss, of energy, which is also clear and transparent and lucid, which is almost like the clear light nature of the mind is like this. It's almost like this subjective expression of emptiness. Emptiness is like an objective description of things. Subjectively speaking, that's like the clear light nature of the mind. There was another hand up here. Is there, Tashi, is there anybody coming in with questions from online? Oh yes, let me know. What's the question? If you can, yeah, you can read it to me. So just one online?
There's two questions.
Oh, two. Okay, let's hear them both.
The first one is, are there stages of vipassana that are concrete as the samatha stages?
Are there stages of vipassana that are what?
Concrete as the samatha stages.
As concrete?
Vipassana.
Yeah.
That are as concrete as the samatha stages.
Yeah, there are. There's 4 stages in particular, and there's a lot of sub-stages. This is written less about. I mean, it's sort of less available. Although I think actually Thurman has a translation, maybe a 70-page translation, in his book called The Life and Teachings of Tsongkhapa, which originally was a Library of Tibetan Works and Archives book. I have the original falling apart copy from the 1970s. It was just republished, I think by Wisdom Publications, but it was just republished, a new edition of it. And so in there he has about a 70-page translation of Tsongkhapa's middle-length treatise on Vipassana, and in there he goes into the different levels and stages. You can also find it to some extent in his in the full-length version of the Stages of the Path, Lamrim Chenmo, which was published in 3 volumes by Snowline in the early 2000s. So there's an entire section on Vipassana in there as well that gives very concrete stages. And what was the other question?
These are 2 same questions. They just repeat it.
Oh, it was the same question twice. Okay. All right, same answer then. Yes, Talia.
What's your opinion about combining the practice of shamatha and vipassana? I just hear about all these vipassana retreats, and I'm
Sure.
just avoiding them because I just don't know if I should just start with shamatha.
Well, in terms of combining them, again, it's It's an interesting question because the standard sort of exoteric answer to that, which again Kamala Shila among others really makes this case strongly, is you can't combine them. They actually compete with each other. If you're analyzing, your mind is doing this, right? You're taking things apart, and your mind's not staying still, and you can't do shamatha. And if you're doing shamatha, you can't, like they sort of work against each other. Eventually, the goal is to combine them. But in terms of practically speaking, you have to sort of do one or the other. Sometimes you can do one for a bunch of. In some contexts, they will say, I think Shantideva even says, in this book, which everyone should read and have, Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. I brought this along because not only is it a great book, it's the book that the Dalai Lama, since Force for Good is being inspired by the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama says this is the one book, the Bodhicharya Avatara, Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. It's the one book you should have. It's your desert island book. If you're going to have only one book, this is it. He says this should be on your bedstand next to your bed, and the pages should turn black because you look at it constantly. So this is the book, sort of, in terms of what it means to be a Buddhist practitioner. 10 chapters. They covers the 6 perfections and various other topics. And I brought this along also partly because one of the chapters is on meditation. And we won't have time probably tonight to go into it, but it would be instructive to see, since we're questioning, well, what is meditation? Be interesting to see what he says. There's like 100 and something verses on what meditation is, and it's probably not at all what you think. There's 1 or 2 references to shamatha and vipassana, and the entire rest of it's about all sorts of other things you cultivate. So he does discuss it, but I think Shantideva, when he mentions shamatha and vipassana, says sort of the standard thing of basically you develop your shamatha first. Once you get your shamatha nailed down, then you take that ability of your mind, super strong, powerful, focused, and now you apply that to analysis, and your analysis is now like a diamond drill that really drills deeply. In practice, most people don't do that. They'll get their shamatha up to a certain level, and then they'll take it and apply it to analytical meditation. And then maybe at some point their analysis gets good enough and they realize they need to go back and do some shamatha for another 6 months or whatever. So but you're sort of focusing mainly on one or the other for any particular phase. You're not doing both simultaneously. Again, Tantra is considered the exception to that because you are doing both simultaneously. That's one of the things that makes it unique. But another part of your question, which is, should I go on you said you're hesitant to go on a Vipassana retreat. Another thing to be aware of is that it can get confusing in the West, particularly, because if you see, there's a Vipassana retreat, okay, I'm going to go learn how to analyze, and you go and you'll end up watching your breath, and you'll think, well, wait a minute, I thought that was shamatha. The way the term Vipassana is used in Pali or Theravada context, it's not different than Mahayana, but it's sort of different. It can seem different because there's a practice called Satipatthana in Pali, or Smriti Upasthana in Sanskrit, which means that you're using the 4 bases of mindfulness. There are 4 things you focus on to develop mindfulness: body, feelings, I'm forgetting one. Body, feelings, mind, and all phenomena. Right. So there's 4 bases, or 4 sort of categories of things that you learn to develop mindfulness on. One of them is the body, of feeling and sensations, and so that one you use the breath. And so the 4 bases of mindfulness, it can seem like you're actually analyzing your body to find if there's a self somewhere. And one of the things you do in the process of doing that is you focus on different aspects of your feelings in your body, one of which is the breath in your nose. And so it is it can be called Vipassana, or it can be called shamatha, and it can get confusing. In the Mahayana context and the Tibetan context, they clearly separate them. So, I wouldn't, in terms of if there's the Pali term is vipassana, right, which is a little bit different than vipashyana in Sanskrit. So if you see there's a retreat, a vipassana retreat, it's coming from the Pali tradition, and it's going to be probably related to the 4 bases of mindfulness, and you're probably going to be doing more of this kind of what you might normally think of as shamatha. If you go to a Tibetan center like the Shambhala Center, or maybe here, I think they might do some meditation classes on shamatha, then it's going to be probably just the breath meditation. I wouldn't be shy about it, though. I wouldn't worry about it. It's good to do your homework, to know who the teacher is and what the system is and what the tradition is and so forth. The more informed you are, the better. But I personally, this is just my own opinion, I don't think there's anything wrong at all with trying both out, or trying out multiple ones. Tibetan Lamas I've studied with encourage that. You know, you don't want to do that forever. You don't want to keep shopping forever and never settle down. Too many people do that. They just keep trying things for short. You know, they don't get the results they want in 6 months, and they're on to the next one. There's a problem with that for sure. But there is something to be said for trying out a few different ones. Try a couple different traditions of shamatha, a couple traditions of vipassana, a couple different teachers. Maybe do something in the morning, you know, half an hour every morning, then try a 2-week retreat or a weekend retreat. You know, try it out in different ways, and eventually find one that seems like it works for you, and then focus on that and try to stick with that for a while. Yes? Can you attain shamatha through yoga? Well, what's that? Yeah, I was going to say you must mean Ashtanga yoga, because again, I'll simply point out on my nice long list here, the term yoga, where am I, shows up all over the place. Here's just the basic term yoga. But creation stage yoga, utpatti krama is yoga, nishpana krama yoga, here's sannimitta yoga, animitta yoga. The word yoga is extremely diverse. It can mean all sorts of things. Ashtanga yoga, there's certain things like Ashtanga yoga and Hatha yoga in Buddhist practice as well. It's used in the service of usually tantric, you know, creation stage yoga and perfection stage yoga. Certain physical yogas are. So, having said that, in terms of Ashtanga yoga by itself, I don't think by itself that would do it. I mean, it's certainly doing physical yogas like Ashtanga or Hatha yoga. Certainly is as you would know if you've done it. It's not just limbering up your body and developing the good old yoga butt or whatever it is people develop in the yoga studios. You're actually learning to actually open up your chakras and your nadis, your energy system, getting the prana to flow and so forth. Yes, it certainly creates, it moves your mind in the direction of shamatha for sure. You certainly create all sorts of much more focused and lucid experiences, mental experiences as well as physical. But I don't think I don't think by itself that would produce shamatha. It would still require you to, you're training your mind really. But it can help. It can definitely be an augment or a benefit. Other questions? Yes?
Can you say something about mindfulness only because it's so prevalent and there's so much confusion around that term?
Yeah. I didn't bring the book that I referred to. But I think there's a passage I flagged in here. I don't know if I can find it quickly, where he addresses that. Let me see if I can find it. If I do flag it here. I know. I wrote a comment on the top of the page. So let me skim for that. Really, the main issue has to do with you always hear in modern day. You hear the modern day representations of mindfulness that it's developing non-judgmental awareness. Right. This is the phrase you hear all the time. And strangely enough, although there's a place for that for sure in mindfulness meditation in Buddhist context, first of all, mindfulness means a lot more than just what it's presented to be. And it also has to be distinguished from introspection. And notice when you're doing this, when you're doing mindfulness and introspection combined, you're definitely being judgmental. Now, at certain points, it can be, I understand why in the popular context, in mindfulness retreats and so forth, because we tend to be so judgmental, beat ourselves up, it can be very helpful to learn to not be judgmental. There's certainly a place for that, and there's contexts in which what's called mindfulness meditation or mindfulness, it's not even so much like it's a type of meditation, it's an augment, it's an aspect of meditation. There's times in which the non-judgmental thing can be very helpful. But mindfulness in and of itself doesn't mean always being not like as soon as the judgment comes in, there's a problem, and now you're not being a good mindfulness practitioner. To be judgmental, or to use the more proper word probably, is to be discriminative, to discriminate. That's a huge part of mindfulness within the Buddhist context. You're discriminating, you're noticing, is my mind doing this or doing that? Oh, it's doing laxity or it's doing excitement. That's a problem. I need to apply an antidote. So it's not always just being non-judgmental, for example. And the other big issue that a lot of the authors in that book bring up is that the way mindfulness practice has been appropriated and is being taught in the West is it's been extracted out of the Buddha. We've seen here in the three talks I'm giving, meditation, wisdom, and ethics, right? There's a particular technique that's being extracted out of that whole tripartite context and just being taught as a technique in and of itself. You're extracting it, among other things, from ethics. And the problem there is, and again the authors in this book write about this, is that you can develop strong mindfulness, strong focused mind, and use it to be, and they do this, they use it to be a better marksman, a better sniper. The military uses mindfulness training to train people to be better snipers, to kill people more effectively. You can use mindfulness in all sorts of ways that Buddhists would consider as just like, whoa, that's a really bad thing. And it's in business retreats, right? Learning to be a better businessman so you can think more quickly and like get the other guy and make the trade quicker and like make the profit and smash the, and win the competition. So mindfulness can be used in all sorts of sort of unethical ways. So there's a couple different reasons why. Let me see. That's just a couple summary points. Does that help? Okay. Yes, but that was a good question. And I would really strongly recommend finding that book, again by Wisdom Publications, to read it. It's not just all negative. It's not just it's also what's right. It's really an in-depth exploration by 14 different authors on what is and what isn't mindfulness, really, from both some Indian, but mostly from Zen traditions, actually. It's the authors are more coming from a Zen background, but some of them are coming from an Indian background as well. I don't think there's a Tibetan author in there. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not finding the thing I flagged. But he has an entire section in here where he talks about that very point, about it not being non-judgmental. Yeah, I'm not finding it, sorry. Other questions, comments, anything else online? Okay, good. Oh, we went over. It's past 9. Oh, well, we're done anyway. We went 8 minutes over. Okay. All right, well, good. Thank you. And maybe hope to see some of you next week. All right, thank you.
This video was brought to you in part through the generous support of Tibet House US membership community and viewers like you. To learn more about the benefits of Tibet House membership, please visit tibethouse.us. Thanks for watching. Tashi Delek.